This is Wednesday, March 23rd, 2022, and this is a continuation of our discussion on Hobbes. Again, we're not meeting in person on Friday, and I have sent your midterm out, so let's finish our discussion of Hobbes. You should have in front of you Hobbes, Mr. Hobbes himself, the notes for Monday and today that I passed out, and the printed sheet, the illegible printed sheet that I had written out from the material on the board. So we'll walk through the rest of the Leviathan guided by this material. So from the notes from today, this is where we left off. We're discussing chapter 13. Now, in the incoherent and unregulated train of thoughts that constitutes my inner mental life, we were actually discussing what Hobbes means by why Hobbes considers his teaching to be true, which was not only because of the nature of science and that he lays out a scientific understanding of cosmology, human psychology, and as you'll see, the erection of an invention and creation of scientific political authority and politics. But we were talking about, again, his standard of truth. And we talked about science, as I mentioned, the proper definition of things, so that one term is adequately attached to and never varies in its meaning from what you're referring to in the outside word. That's the difference between a common sense or a natural grasp of external reality versus a scientific one. I don't think Hobbes is any different, by the way, from Descartes on this. On this question, I think their notion of science is identical. The only difference is, of course, and this is what makes Hobbes so important and different, is Hobbes takes that scientific method and applies it for the first time to the human condition and to politics. So the first two sources of truth were science, and then from the author's introduction that we read on page 82, introspection. And then there's a third kind of empirical dimension of observation, which is kind of an extension of introspection. And this is what we had started to look at. So I think that Aaron had finished reading on page 186 that great description of the state of nature, which is almost like what it's like to grow up in Newark, New Jersey. Because the state of nature, because we're equal, because we have no natural ruler, because we are equal in our core ability to die and to kill, and because we are all equally moved by the same passions, which is the desire to remain alive and avoid a violent death, the desire, a competition for the same things in front of us, and because of distrust and a sense of glory. Now, we'll come back to this. Hobbes thinks that human beings have a natural sense of pride and a desire to dominate over others and to experience pride in their presence because because others are such a natural threat to us. The only way that we can actually feel comfortable in their presence insofar as we are capable of it. And he says on page 185 that again, men have no natural pleasure, but the contrary, a good deal of grief in keeping company, where there is no power to overawe them all. So Hobbes does not, by the way, this is why this is called a state of nature. For Aristotle, just by way of contrast, human beings are naturally political. We're naturally social. Now, as modernity unfolds, and we turn to Locke and Rousseau, we'll discuss what it means for these authors to talk about human beings as if nature made us simply solitary, alone, and unattached. But that is exactly the idea here. We do not naturally form society with other human beings. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what about sex? It's not that we don't do things together, and Rousseau is going to have the neatest explanation of this. Because Rousseau is going to explore the sexual drive, which is obviously natural, but he's going to argue that that does not necessarily lead to the natural family, because people say, but what about the family? What about the village and this kind of stuff? For Aristotle, human beings naturally, of course, not only have sex with each other, but they naturally form associations, first partner, children, wife, then the village, and the polis is the final natural outgrowth of human sociality. But that's Aristotle, that's antiquity. The moderns reject the idea that human beings are by nature political. We are by nature apolitical. Politics, as you're going to see as we move up to it in chapter 17 of the Leviathan, is artificial. It's an invention. Like speech and reason, it's added onto our natural beings. It transforms our natural beings, but it's not part of our nature. There is no natural difference between a human being and an animal and any other part of the cosmological universe as matter in motion. Now, to get back to that great quote, so the state of nature, we're equal, we're in conflict with each other, and because we're always fighting with each other, because the state of nature, the other two terms that are exactly identical to it are the state of perfect equality and the state of perfect war. The war of all against all, which is what he comes on page 185 and 186, which means there's no time, there's no opportunity to acquire property. Property is not a natural experience. There's no comfort in this state of nature. It's terrible. That condition, as he sums up in his great and well-known phrase, is in the last sentence of the paragraph on 186. No society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, like a non-ending faculty meeting. Now, here's the passage that we were talking before, and this is what we finished in class today. And this is part of Hobbes' empirical sense of the truth of the teaching of the Leviathan. It may seem strange to some man that has not well weighed these things, that nature should thus disassociate and render men too apt to invade, invade and destroy one another. And he may therefore, not trusting to this inference made from the passions, more about that in chapter 6 in a minute, desire perhaps to have the same confirmed by experience, which is, in Hobbes' mind, is what makes this which makes it empirical. Let him therefore consider with himself, when taking a journey, he arms himself and seeks to go well accompanied. When going to sleep, he locks his doors. And when even in his own house he locks his chests. And this, when he knows that there be laws and public officers armed to revenge all injuries, except if you live in San Francisco and New York, done to him, what opinion he has of his fellow subjects when he rides arms, of his fellow citizens when he locks his doors, and of his children and servants and his own wife, you might say, when he locks his chest. Does he not therefore as much accuse mankind by his actions as I do by my words? How is this an empirical proof? If we were so naturally trusting of each other, and we were so naturally in associating with each other, Hobbes says, well then, why do you behave as if the human beings around you are your enemies? What he's actually suggesting is what you need to do is look beyond the phenomenal appearance of the world and start to look inside and around. So this is what makes Hobbes' teaching true in his mind to the reader. It's the first scientific presentation of human psychology and politics. It's you can check inside when he talks about the inner life of a human being, and ultimately, if you watch yourself and the way others behave, like a truly analytical empiricist, you will see that what I am saying is true. Now, let's go back and pick a few things together, and then we'll continue our journey through human beings' natural state, and then the creation of the notion of natural rights in chapter 14, and then in the subsequent chapters 14, 15, 16, the right of nature, natural right, the laws of nature, and the steps that lead scientifically up to the creation of politics. In part 2, the invention of sovereignty. Now again, this is the paper that the material that I wrote on the board and expanded in my comments, and I've also scanned and sent this out as a PDF in addition to the notes. So, on this question, in class discussion, one of you said, well, Machiavelli thinks people are evil. And you would say, But Machiavelli doesn't think people are evil. That's a human value judgment. And Hobbes says exactly the same thing. Let's continue with the passage that we're reading from chapter 13 on page 187. Don't you by your actions accuse people as much as I do by my words. But listen to him. But neither of us accuse man's nature in it. The desires and other passions of man are in themselves no sin, no more than are the actions that proceed from those passions, till they know a law that forbids them, which till laws be made they cannot know, nor can any law be made till they have agreed upon the person that shall make them. So on one level, what Hobbes, and he'll state this again at the end of chapter 13, and in the same way that we saw that Descartes' radical subjectivity can be the root of modern existentialism, well, Hobbes's absolute reduction of human beings to animality and to matter and motion also deprives nature of any source or authority for judgments about just and unjust. They are simply subjective judgments. As Hobbes says earlier, by the way, that it's what we want by our passions that we determine what's good and bad. So Hobbes is just as much a subjectivist or relativist when it comes to value judgments as Nietzsche is, as you will see. Now, to go back to the earlier parts of part one and just a couple of things about reason, science, speech, and the passions. Chapter 1 through 3, as we saw, were like the physical, material foundations of human consciousness, sense, memory, imagination, etc. Chapter 4 about reason or speech we'll come back to in a minute. But again, remember in chapter 3 he says you can have unregulated trains of thought in which everything in your head is just determined by the chaos outside your senses and head. Or you can have a regulated train of thought in which your thoughts are actually guided by some force. Now, the two potential sources of guidance are the passions, which we'll turn to in chapter 6, because this is the critical thing. In chapter 6, Hobbes is now founding his pre-Skinnerian psychology. And we'll see what the passions are and how they're defined and what the relevance of them are. So on page 118 in chapter 6, of the interior beginnings of voluntary motions, commonly called the passions, and the speeches by which they are expressed. And that's why we talked, why this book is so boring for students to read, because it reads like a dictionary, because it is a dictionary. Hobbes is trying to retrain the human mind to understand itself scientifically and the human condition and the universe. So yes, he's trying to make everybody, I suppose some of you loved science in your science classes, but lab experiments and scientific definitions and terms are difficult work. This work is an attempt to be the scientific refoundation of human consciousness, not just for scientists, but for everybody. So on one level, for the new politics and the new human condition to emerge, everybody has to become Hobbes, which is exactly what the purpose of this book is. Just as the same purpose of the discourse on method. Descartes says, oh, my aim is not to reform everyone's thought, it's just to show you how I regulated mine. Baloney. Descartes wants everyone to become Descartes. And by the way, if they're right, if they're right about philosophy, if they're right about science, if they're right about human beings, then we should have it would only be pride on our part not to simply become Descartes or Hobbes. The only alternative, by the way, and this is what a college education is for, is to think their thought through and to see where a reasonable individual may disagree with them. All right, so go back to chapter 6. There be in animals two sorts of motions, peculiar by them. One is called vital, begun in generation and continue without interruption through their whole life. Such are the course of the blood, in other words, what we'd call the autonomous nervous system, and the basic character of animal life that is regulated by physical and chemical and biological processes, and that's what he's called the vital motions. The other is animal motion, considered to be voluntary motion. Now, again, remember, Hobbes is refuting Aristotle. Aristotle argues that the essence of human action is voluntary. Human beings really are free by nature, according to Aristotle, because we have parts of our consciousness that animals don't have, especially reason and self-consciousness, which, according to Aristotle, generates freedom. Hobbes is going to argue, there's no such thing as natural reason or natural consciousness that would generate natural freedom. It turns out what we call voluntary actions are just as pertinent to animals as to us, and they are originated in the passion. So what's a passion? The other is animal motion, which is sometimes called voluntary motion, as to go, to speak, and any of the other limbs, motion of the other limbs. That sense is motion in the organs and interior parts of man's body, and by the things we see here. And so, in other words, all the things we want and have passions for, and we'll actually see the actual formal definition of a passion on page 119, it has their origin in let's just simplify it. All the things we want are because of the results of sensory experience of things that we've had, whether it's our mother's milk at her breast, chocolate brownies, special chocolate brownies, etc., whatever. They've all originated in some kind of vital animal motion that's constructed out of part of our physical constitution and the remnant of sensory experience or imagination, etc. It creates what he calls an endeavor. And on page 119, here's the definition of that endeavor or passion. This endeavor, when it is towards something which causes it, is called appetite or desire, the latter being the general name and the other oftentimes restrained to signify the desire of food, namely hunger and thirst. When the endeavor is fromward something, is away from something, it is generally called aversion. These words, appetite and aversion, derive from the Latin. They both have the signify of the notions, one of approaching, the other retiring. So, a passion is a motion that starts inside of us when a sensory experience or a memory or imagination of some sensory experience collides with and becomes part of an internal vital motion from our animal construction. And then we experience it as a desire for or an aversion against. Pure Skinnerian psychology, approach avoidance. And because it's for something outside of ourselves, because that's where the original memory of the thing that we want or fear comes from. And this is the true wellspring of human action. And human life is simply one passion after another. And by the way, let me get this quote about the relativism on page 120. But whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is, what he for his part calleth good, and the object of his hate and aversion evil. And so Hobbes is clearly unleashing his own moral relativism here. What we call good and bad is just what we find pleasurable or painful. So there's no science of morals per se outside the one that he's erecting here based on animal psychology. But again, this is pure modern behaviorism. This shouldn't be utterly foreign to you if you've had a psychology class, especially in the psychology of B.F. Skinner. Continuing, we'll come back to the passions and how they establish the theme of life in a minute. But first, I want to take us through reason and speech, because it's the other element of human consciousness, which is the great basis of science. It's the whole notion of how human beings can come to understand and control their world, and as a result of a certain use of reason and speech, precise and perfect definition, as we've seen. But remember, this is not natural. This is a byproduct of the invention and creation of words, which in no way creates a different kind of human consciousness or space in the universe, other than physical, chemical, biological, and animal motion. First, before we turn to chapter 4, just a diversionary passage from chapter 2 on the bottom of page 93. Remember, sense begets memory, begets imagination. And look at the bottom paragraph of page 93 and the top of 94. The imagination that is raised in man or any other creature endued with the faculty of imagining by words or their voluntary signs is what we generally call understanding, and is common to man and beast. For a dog, by custom, will understand the call and the rating of his master, and will so many other beasts. That understanding which is peculiar to man. Now, whenever an author says what's unique or peculiar to man, you are getting to what he or she considers to be the definition of human life. Is the understanding not only his will, but his conceptions and thoughts. by the sequel and contexture of the names of things into affirmations, negations, and other forms of speech. And this kind of understanding I shall speak of hereafter, which is in Chapter 4 on reason and speech. So if you turn to Chapter 4, on page 100, 101, let's look at a couple of passages. The first author of speech was God himself. And you're going to see what Hobbes has, what he has to say about the Bible and the Bible's claims to truth and statements in a minute. But for the Scripture goes no further in this matter, but this was sufficient to direct him to add names, as to the experience and use of the creature should give him occasion, and to join them such in manner by degrees as to make himself understood. And by the succession of time so much language might be gotten, as he had found use for, though not so copious as the orator of a philosopher is needed of. A swipe at philosophers. On the next page, 101, the general use of a speech is to transfer our mental discourse into verbal, or the train of our thoughts into a train of words. And that for our thoughts into a train of words, and that for two commodities. One is by which the registration of the consequences of our thoughts to help our thoughts follow one another. I'm still working on that myself. By such words as were marked for, and may be recalled later. So that the first use of names is to serve for marks or notes of remembrance. Another is when many use the same words to signify by their common order one to another, to communicate, in other words. So the first use of words is to create a marker in our memory of a sensory experience. And that's what words do. It adds an overlay to sensory experience and memory and imagination that animals don't have, unless insofar as they come in contact with human beings. And that's like an internal marker. It actually creates a kind of a nanosecond of delay, if you will, between the physical processes of sense, memory, and imagination and our mental life. And then the second one is to communicate our thoughts to others. And when they are used for this, they are called signs. Special uses for speech are, first, to register by what cogitation we find to be the cause of anything. So there's a direct line between the invention of words, the sequence of thoughts, the memory of things, and the awareness of causality, which he will come back to at the beginning of chapter 12. And so look at those uses. Now, this is critical, because this is the basis of the Hobbesian Cartesian designation of all pre-scientific consciousness as a form of muddledness, sloppy-headedness, bad language, etc. The four abuses of speech on page 102. To these uses there are also four correspondent abuses. First, when men register their thoughts wrong by the inconstancy of the signification of their words, by which they register for their conceptions that which they were never conceived, and so deceive themselves. When they start using different words for the same thing, or the same word for different things. Second, and this is one of the most critical passages in the book, when they use words metaphorically, that is, in another sense other than they are ordained for, and therefore deceive others. Third, when they use the words they declare to be their will, and which is not, when they lie, etc. Now, here's the point, and look at the fourth one. The one thing I want to focus your attention here is metaphorical speech, which for Hobbes is connotative when you, and as the critical thing is, he reveals this to be a form of lying and deception. And why is that important? Because throughout the Leviathan, in both parts 1 and 2, and in parts 3 and 3, Hobbes lets you know that the language of Scripture is metaphorical speech, which is to say, any time that Scripture refers to God or any aspect of spiritual life as metaphorical, or even the idea of a soul, Hobbes has already told you skillfully that in the first parts of the book, that any speech that departs from scientific language is a form of deception or lying. So Scripture is nothing other than a tally of fables, which, as you're going to see in chapter 11, he's pretty explicit about, and lies. So all metaphorical speech might be pretty, it might be fun to listen to, but it's a lie. It's not scientific. And to connect the definition of speech in chapter 4 with the definition of science and the definition of definition that we saw earlier, on from chapter 5 on reason and science, on page 111. out of all which we may define, that is to say, determine what that is, which is meant by this word reason, when we reckon it amongst the faculties of the mind, for reason in this sense is nothing but reckoning, that is the adding and subtracting of the consequences of general names agreed on, for the marking and signifying of our thoughts. I say marking when we reckon them by ourselves, and signifying when we demonstrate to others. And again, that completes the idea that what science is perfected speech, in the sense of it's perfectly defined, perfectly regulated, measured, etc. And again, as I said several times, I think this is identical to Descartes' understanding of what science, scientific reasoning, consciousness, and method is. So in the intervening chapters in the Leviathan, he'll build up his terminology, defining each one, and in chapter 10 he'll get to the key term of power, which power is indistinguishable from what Machiavelli means by power, Descartes means by power, the ability to manipulate or control something, and to get what you want. Power is an instrument to the end of your passions. And in chapter 11, which is in the way in my scheme of the unfolding of Leviathan, is his general clearing away, explaining how prior human life and consciousness, and so chapter 11 and 12 kind of perform a critical function of explaining how we got to be unscientific creatures, and what makes us different from animals. That's chapter 12, and the seed of religion. But as you're going to see, Hobbes will also define that as the seed of science, with a credible. And you'll see once all of this is established, then we can see human beings clearly, as nature makes them in chapter 13, and begin the empirical scientific reconstruction of human life and consciousness and politics. So what does all this move in the direction of answering? So on the notes, this is Roman numeral 2D, the meaning of life, on page 161. So that I place in the first a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power, that ceaseth only in death. And the cause of this is not always that man hopes for a more intensive delight than he has already attained, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he hath present without the acquisition of more. Very Machiavellian thought. A prince has to acquire. Why? Not just to gratify his desires, but if he doesn't acquire, then he'll lose what he has. Hence it is that kings whose power is greatest turn their endeavors to assuring it is at home by laws or abroad by wars. And when that is done, they are succeeded at the new desire, and some of fame for new conquest, in others, like that of Vladimir Putin, of ease and sensual pleasure, and in others of admiration or being flattered, or the excellence in some art, or some ability of the mind. So let's jump ahead to chapter 12 for a minute, because you'll see that Hobbes then has this kind of summary discussion of animal and human psychology and the core differences between us and animals. So look on page 12, chapter 12 on religion, and what he's talking is the seed of religion, where religion comes from. And you'll see the seed of religion is the same as the seed of science. It comes from the curiosity and awareness of causes that's born of language. So on the bottom of 168, but you also see this is also a definition of human life. And first, it is peculiar to the nature of man, to go up to the beginning passage of chapter 12. Seeing there are no signs nor fruits of religion, but in man only, there is no cause to doubt that the seed of religion is also only in man. So only human beings have science and religion, and consists in some peculiar quality, at least in some eminent degree, not to be found in other living creatures. And first, it is peculiar to the nature of man to become inquisitive as to the causes of the events they see, some more, some less. But all men so that they are curious in the search of the causes for their own good and evil fortune. Second, so you see this as a reverse explanation. We are curious about causes. Then in this second, he's going to show where that curiosity of causes comes from. Second, upon the sight of anything that hath beginning, that it also had a cause, which is determined the same to begin when it did, and sooner rather than later. So the awareness of causes rests upon and depends upon the ability to see the beginnings and ends of things. You can't be curious about what causes something unless you notice that it begins at a certain time and ends at a certain time. And that is the byproduct of the marking of consciousness by words. Our words give us that momentary pause between simple sensory influence and our thoughts. And that's what gives us the room, if you want to call it this, to see the beginnings and ends, and hence the causes. Thirdly, and this is the deepest part, where there is no other felicity of beasts but the enjoying of their quotidian food, fat, ease, and lust. Quotidian is the fancy word for every day or present, right in front of them. Animals want what they want in front of them right now. As having little or no forethought of time to come, for want or lack of observation, and memory of the order, consequence, and dependence of the things we see. Man observeth how one event hath been produced by another, and remembereth in antecedence and consequence. And when he cannot assure himself of the true causes of things, for the causes of good and evil fortune are for the most part invisible, he supposes causes of them, either such as his own fancy suggests, or trusteth to the authority of other men, such as he thinks to be his friends and wiser than himself. By the way, that paragraph, the last part of that paragraph, is a summary of the passages on page 166 and page 168 to the conclusion of chapter 11 on customs or manners. What Hobbes is explaining in chapter 11 on customs and manners, as he says, is not why some people pick their teeth or how, but how human beings have come to be divided into different communities of political, customary, and religious beliefs. And you'll see in that passage, as referred to, it's because in our very infancy of human life, when we were just crawling out of the caves, and before we had electric cars, that we in our primitive state and mind, when the human race was children, like you were and we were all are, well, you trusted your parents to explain things, but they were no better at understanding than you were, and so they made up stories and fables. And he says, if the human mind could have known things like it knows math, then there wouldn't be differences of opinions. And in that passage, you'll see, he actually shows that mathematical science consciousness can actually become universal once the human race learns to think scientifically. Then perhaps linguistic, certainly cultural, certainly political differences will disappear. And of course, those political differences will disappear once the language of politics, the scientific language of politics that he's establishing in chapters 13 through 17 become the foundation of human politics. So to go back to chapter 12. So great, we can see and understand and follow causality, and when be curious about its causes. When we don't know the causes, that's called religion or superstition and things other than what you believe, or science, when you can actually follow the train through scientific consciousness. The first two make anxiety. For being assured there be causes of things that have arrived hitherto or shall arrive, it is impossible for a man who continually endeavoreth to secure himself against the evil he fears, which is life, not to be in perpetual solicitude of the time to come, so that every man, especially those who are overly provident or foreseeing, are in a state like that of Prometheus. For Prometheus, which is interpreted as the prudent man, Prometheos is Greek for the one who sees before, is of large, it's to the hill caucus, a large prospect where an eagle feeding on his liver devoured in the day, you know the story from Hesiod. So that man, which looks too far before him in the care of future times, hath his heart all day long gnawed on by fear of death, poverty, or other calamity, and has no repose nor pause of his activity but in sleep, which, of course, the big sleep is death. So what I've just done is walk you through E. Now, to go back to where we were left in class today, the whole point of chapter 13 and 14 especially is to provide now the empirical scientific view of human beings by nature, as nature makes us, and as we saw in class today. It makes us equal, equally capable to die and kill, and also equal with respect to our passions and our basic abilities. And that means that since we're equal, that means there's no human being that's superior to another, no natural ruler. So our natural condition is not being ruled, which is one of isolation and war, according to Hobbes. Why? Because we need the things we want so badly, and our passion for life is so active that people we just don't perceive them as a threat, although we do. They are a threat. So our natural condition of equality, perfect equality, is also perfect war. And that leads to that great paragraph on chapter 13 that we read in class. That means that in our state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and awful. It's like a class with Dr. Dunn, which the people in this class, the ones that have to sit for another 50 minutes in this horrible classroom, understand what the state of nature is. Now I want to turn back to a critical question then, in chapter 13, when he lays out the state of nature, and that is its reality. So on one level, turn to page 187. Was there ever, and is there now, is this state of nature, which Hobbes, again, discovers by peeling away, so to speak, as will Locke and Rousseau. All the things that must exist in us by society, take those away, you must have human beings the way nature made us, just as we come fresh out of the womb. So turn to page, because this is going to be a critical difference between Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. On page 187, it may be peradventure be thought that there never was such a time, nor condition of war as this, and I believe it was never generally so all over the world. So, was this our original universal natural condition at the beginning of history? Maybe, maybe not. He wasn't there, he doesn't know, he says maybe, but maybe not. But he still says it's real, and it exists now. When? But there are many places where they live so now. For the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord of which depends upon natural lust, have no government at all, and live at this day in the brutish manner, as I said before. Yes, he's a Eurocentric asshole who thinks that the people who live in tribal life are closer to the state of nature. But so does Locke and Rousseau, and so do modern romanticists who believe that somehow primitive peoples are more natural than the plastic lives that you and I live today. However, it must be perceived a manner that would be where there were no common power to fear. The whole point of what defines the state of nature that derives from our equality and leads to war is the absence of a common power. It is not natural for us to have a common power over us, which is why the state of nature is one of isolation, war, and etc. But though there never had been any time where particular men were in a condition of war, yet in all times, now this is where Hobbes would say the state of nature is a real observable thing now. Kings and persons of sovereign authority, because of their independence, are in continual jealousies and the state of posture of gladiators, having their weapons pointing and their eyes fixed on one another, that is, their forts, etc., etc. As you're going to see, and whenever you ride unaccompanied, without the presence of the law, when you're alone, and there's another human being present. Hobbes says the state of nature actually really exists between the heads of nations, and that's why international relations is so horrible, because that's our state of nature. There is no common, unless, of course, one of the kings or princes should try to be a world conqueror like a Napoleon or an Alexander or a Putin or a Xi, conquer the world and bring all human beings under one common power. Then that would lead to the position of universal peace, by the way, which Hobbes thinks is the promise of science and politics. And I think ultimately is what he's hoping for humanity, that all of the nations will be conquered eventually and brought under one rule. Now, by the time that modern thought moves on, that hope for unified human politics becomes part of the growth of the Enlightenment. And Kant will actually, in his interesting essay called Perpetual Peace, argue that it's only when human beings have a common government of republics over republics and humanity is united into one political species that there will be such a thing as peace. But he gets that idea from Hobbes. On the question of justice and injustice, and we'll look at my handwritten thing from the board too. To this war of every man against every man, this is also consequent that nothing can be just. This is on page 188, the last page of chapter 13. Notions of right and wrong justice have there no place in the state of nature. Everything's fair in love and war. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. In force and fraud, in war, where the two cardinal virtues, justice and justice, are none of the faculties of the body of the mind that are useful in war. So all morality, all judgments of justice and unjust are completely either individual to the subject to the individual, or the result of legal authority. So in ancient political philosophy, you might have remembered Thrasymachus from the Republic, who is a conventionalist. So, in other words, Hobbes is formulating the idea that all moral judgments have their origins in convention or in subjective personal experience. Now, that goes on then. Now we see, now if you're looking at my sheet, the way I try to summarize a couple of things here. So I had, I think it was Adara read this, but to summarize chapter 13, the state of nature, that's the little point of matter, us, in motion, life, and wanting to remain alive, surrounded by an infinite sphere of liberty. At the beginning of chapter 14, the right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturale, natural justice or natural right, is the liberty each man hath to use his own power as he will himself, for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which in his own judgment and reason he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. By liberty I mean, as understood according to the absence of external impediments, which impediments may take away part of a man's power to do what he wants. We'll come back to the law of nature in a minute. So what's a natural right? And that's why you have to imagine a human being as a dot of matter in motion surrounded by an infinite universe of liberty, which literally means you have a right to everything in the universe that you judge, or any action or anything in the universe that you judge to be a means to your staying alive. So there are no moral limits to the liberty by nature, and everyone has that equally. Now, of course, what happens when you have equal packets of matter with infinite liberty around them bumping into each other is that leads to chaos. So as you're going to see, the idea that the only way to have peace on human condition is by alienating part of our liberty, what you're going to see is laying down of right or the transfer of right, and creating an artificial power over us is the only way that human beings can have peace. So, to use my handout in the middle of the page, so nature, we are equal packets of matter in motion, moved by the passion to remain in motion, fear of death, colliding with each other, equal packets of matter in motion. That's the state of war. And how do you get from chapter 13 to 14 and this right of this absolute liberty that nature gives us all equally to do whatever we need to do to stay alive? Because we are naturally equal, we are naturally unruled. This is from my handwritten thing. Hence, our natural liberty to use our reason to remain alive is unlimited. We have liberty to use everything around us to remain alive. And what's the law of nature? Hobbes, I think, is actually being somewhat, quote-unquote, metaphorical here. A law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason by which a man is forbidden to do that which is the destructive of his life or to take away the means of preserving him. And the first law of nature is, of course, to seek peace. Why? Because war is so awful and peace is better. So natural rights are the freedom to stay alive. Natural law is the duty to stay alive no matter what. So if you turn the page of my handwritten notes, what Hobbes is doing in chapters 13 is replacing the superstitious religious customary grounds for political authority based upon false ideas deriving from sloppy language with a true scientific denotative, not connotative or metaphorical account of human nature and political authority. The analogy to geometrical mathematical proofs is intended to be complete. And either from my notes or from this handwritten. That's why I wrote on the board. You start with the observable thing of a point. Then, just like geometry and mathematics, which defines everything in terms of a measurable, definable, or observable reality, you move. A line is, by definition, a series of points. A plane is an intersection of lines. A solid is an intersection of planes. That is to say, you move from what's perfectly definable and empirical, step by step, with no motion of faith or ignorance to where political power comes from. And you'll see in chapters 14 through 16, this leads to equal natural human beings. That's chapter 13, that's the point. Having rights. So that's kind of like a human being in nature's being equal to each other and having the liberty to stay alive and use your discretion to stay alive is the point. Then, the elements to get from a point to a line to a plane to a solid are provided in the subsequent chapter. So, called sovereignty. Sovereignty, and as he will say in chapter 17, is that artificial person, that Leviathan, that we create out of the pooled authority that we once had by nature. Now, of course, as this idea unfolds in subsequent authors like Locke and Rousseau, covenanting and compacting becomes the language of consent. And that's why it ends up in the Declaration of Independence that way. All legitimate authority is grounded in compact and consent. The difference between Hobbes and you'll see Locke and Rousseau is, if somebody terrifies you into doing something, it's still valid because you still agreed to do it. And so we arrive at part 2 of the Leviathan, Politics, Commonwealth. And here on the page 223, the opening of chapter, and this is, by the way, this is why I drew on the board and in my notes the analogy to mathematics. So we're now at sovereignty or commonwealth, which is the solid, the final chain of geometry arrived step by step. Page 223. The final cause, end, or design of men, who naturally love liberty and dominion over others, is the introduction of that restraint upon themselves, in which we see them live in commonwealths, is the foresight of their own preservation and of a more contented life. That is to say, of getting themselves out of that miserable condition of war, which is naturally consequent, as has been shown to the natural passions of men, where there is no visible power to keep them in awe, and tie them by fear of punishment to the performance of their covenants and observation of those laws of nature set down in the 14th and 15th chapters. So, the sovereign is that artificial person, that Leviathan, which comes from the Bible, by the way, the book of Job, the king of the proud, the mighty monster who terrifies everyone into obedience and conquers the proud, the pride in every human being to have your own way. But out of that comes the peace, which is the benefit of civil society. So let me walk you then through his political teaching in part 2. So again, the origin of this political authority is not God. It's not fear of some powers invisible. Political power is a fear of power visible. And you're going to see that Hobbes, like Aristotle's political science, is an arrangement of different kinds of institutional rules. If you're looking both at my notes, both on page 2 of the notes and Roman numeral 4 in letter A and B, and in my handwritten comment. So politics, the only purpose of politics is to live in this life, not to save your soul, but it's to have a longer and more comfortable and secure life in this world. And we've already gone through its generation. To read on B in my notes, since human nature is so fractious, so disputatious, so ill-suited to provide the conditions of peace that our own nature requires, an artificial force of such unequal, overawing magnitude must be created, which forces human beings to subdue those elements which lead to conflict and war and disobedience. That's the great Leviathan on page 227, the king of the proud. Fear is the primary glue of the political world. And you'll see, I'll read through my handwritten comments, which also compares Aristotle to Hobbes' new political science in this and subsequent chapters of part 2. On my handwritten notes, page 3. Aristotle's political science is founded upon classifying politics into 6 types of regimes or constitutions: number, one, few, and many, and just and unjust, as I revealed in class last Friday. And it must be replaced by a modern political science, this is what Hobbes is doing, based only on number: one, few, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. Aristotle, old and stinky, on the left of that page, you see 6 kinds of constitutions. But remember, there is no such thing as justice and injustice outside of the authority of politics and conventional law. So there are only 3 kinds of constitutions: one, monarchy, rule of few, aristocracy, and many, democracy. Hobbes says all these terms that you've heard, like tyranny or oligarchy, when you don't like your government, you call it by bad names: tyranny and oligarchy. The best form of government, and this is what emerges in chapters 18 and 19, etc., once you create sovereignty, what's the best kind of government? Is absolute monarchy, because it generates more universal terror most effectively, and therefore keeps the peace better. So better Stalin than the state of nature. So on the last page of my handwritten notes, hence Hobbes is the true founder of modern equality, freedom, and politics. Politics, sovereignty, the common good, is an instrument as revealed in chapter 17 and subsequently, artificially created to maintain and secure individuals' life, liberty, and happiness, deriving all of its legitimate power from laid down, transferred, formerly infinite natural rights of individuals. Its purpose, to create peace, always better than war, through channelized, predictable fear and terror, because the only way that the sovereign will kill or come after you is if you break the laws. So at least you have some control in a condition of peace, law, and politics over your own fate, whereas in the state of nature, you can die at any minute from uncontrollable and unpredictable things. So channelized fear is better than unchannelized fear. Since all judgments, again, have no ground in nature, they only derive from political authority, you have an absolute responsibility to obey the sovereign. So on the last page of my notes, on page 3, if you're following, the structural components, as I've already mentioned, are ruled by number. What are the theoretical components? In chapters 18, page 233, the sovereign is absolute. You must obey. You have an absolute responsibility by the law of nature to secure yourself, to obey the dictates of the sovereign. There is no right of revolution or resistance. That's nonsense. And what's the office or purpose of this sovereignty in chapter 30, 24 and 30? What should the sovereign do to provide if he wants to remain in power? Not that his subjects have a right to resist or rebel, but they will if push comes to shove, is to provide for the peace, security, and prosperity of his people. What's left to the individual subject in this if you have no right to resist political authority? Chapter 21 answers that. The right to kill the sovereign, because if the sovereign comes after you to put you in jail or execute you, then you're back in the state of nature. So you can't disobey the sovereign, but if he comes after you, you can try to kill him. The right to refuse testimony against himself, page 269, the Fifth Amendment. And ultimately, the right to do in your own private sphere whatever the sovereign has not forbidden. And this is the ultimate origin of the Ninth Amendment. The enumeration of rights in the Constitution shall not be understood to limit or construe the ones not enumerated. So here you have all of the essentials of a modern political system. What about feminism? Look on page 20, pages 253 through 254. Hobbes says the only reason men rule over women is because that's the way it's always been, but ultimately women are just as equal as men, and women can kill men just as men equally. So the conclusion of the Leviathan. Well, here's some questions. This is E. Is the cure worse than the disease? This question explains the revision of Hobbes' teaching and understanding and the kind of politics that teaching generates that Locke and Rousseau engineer in their works, revolving around these two issues. One, is Hobbes' theoretical account of human nature, the state of nature, and the transition to political society true? You're going to see Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau adopt the idea of a state of nature as opposed to state of civil society, but they talk about human beings very differently and have a very, very different picture of natural human beings than Hobbes does. Second, can the tendency towards political absolutism in Hobbes' practical teaching be softened or reformulated for the benefit of the ruled? You're going to see that Locke invents modern constitutionalism, the separation of powers and checks and balances, because he would argue that it's worse to be ruled by Stalin than to be in the state of nature, for reasons we'll see. So the conclusion. I talked about parts 3 and 4 of a Christian commonwealth because Hobbes lives in a Christian world and he has to base his teaching upon scriptural authority, which he demolishes in parts 3 and 4, and to show that any version of Christianity which says a Christian has the right to disobey a sovereign based on Christian belief, which is either Catholicism because there's a power that transcends the individual power of sovereigns, or Puritanism because it says Puritans can resist the authority of the state based on Christian conscience, Hobbes says is the kingdom of darkness. And in the review and conclusion, you see, with a slight methodological note, Hobbes understands that the way that his teaching will get from his book to the minds of his students to those is through the universities. It will be a trickle-down teaching by which his book will be adopted by universities, it will be spread and taught, and then eventually it will trickle down into the minds of professionals, it will cross the ocean and be eventually embodied in a document called the Declaration of Independence, which will create the first modern nation based on modern principles, the United States of America. So there you have the Leviathan, and we'll see you next Monday.